is suffering. That is suffering. But that's not the kind of suffering we're going to talk about. The primary suffering we're going to talk about is persecution. The opposition that we get for our faith in Jesus Christ. And you know what? There's a lot of opposition to Christianity. There's a lot of opposition to living a life of faith in Jesus. You know, it's estimated that over 200 million Christians around the world face consistent persecution for their faith in Jesus. And there are a lot of the areas in which they're facing this persecution are either in communist or Muslim countries. Some of the Muslim countries include Turkey and Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, some of these, Pakistan. Now, a lot of times you won't hear this in the news. It'll be masked with such phrases as like, there were national differences or nationalist differences, when ultimately the persecution that came down was because of faith. You know, in Turkey, in 2007, 5 Muslims entered a Christian publishing company and killed 3 believers in the southeastern province of Malatya. 2 of the victims were Turkish converts from Islam. Now, this is a huge area in which Christians will get persecuted. If they've converted from Islam, the very least that's going to happen to those individuals is they're going to be completely excommunicated from their family, cut off completely. This is unfortunately what happens ultimately when that is carried out to its end. And one of the men was a German citizen. It's reported that 4 of the 5 attackers admitted that the killings were motivated by both nationalist and religious feelings. You know, a lot of times when we hear about suffering or persecution as it relates to Christians, we often think of it in terms of like a far-off land. Oh, that's the people in Africa that are getting their heads chopped off for proclaiming Christ. But you know what? The anti-Christian sentiment is growing rapidly in the United States. We like to still think of ourselves as a Christian nation. Not so much. Just recently in Houston, a woman was ordered by local police to stop handing out gospel tracts to children who knocked on her door during Halloween. Officers informed her that such activity is illegal, which is not true, and that she would be arrested if she continued. So cops are telling this woman, you can't hand out gospel tracts. In Wisconsin, there's a national group called the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Freedom from Religion Foundation. They're anti-religion, especially anti-Christian. You'll find it interesting. They're freedom from religion, but you want to know the group that they most persecute? Christians. And what they're doing in Wisconsin is they're distributing anti-Christian pamphlets to public school children entitled, quote, "We can be good without God." They're handing that out to children in schools. You know, the entertainment industry and syndicated media increasingly vilify Christians as sewer rats, vultures, and simple-minded social ingrates. The FBI has even gone so far as to label certain fundamentalist Christian groups as terrorists. And you know, there's even some Christian organizations that are being threatened not to bring their Christian conventions to their city because they're afraid that it's going to stir up hate crimes among minorities. And so Christians are trying to be silenced by these groups, even in the United States. You know, I've had the opportunity, unfortunately, to be on both sides of this issue in terms of suffering. I've been on the sinfulness side. I've definitely been on the side of suffering for my sinfulness. I spent 13 years of my early life building an addiction to pornography and sex. And it was a secret double life. And I'll tell you what, there was suffering involved in that because I was living inconsistent to the way God designed me to live, and so there was suffering. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you're living a double life, there's going to be suffering. You're already suffering because it's just not consistent with who God called you to be. But you know, I've had opportunity to be on the other side too, to stand on the truth. You know, we have a ministry, Be Broken Ministries, and we call pornography evil, and we say that sex outside of marriage is wrong. Is that a popular message in our culture today? No. Porn is a huge business. By the way, actually, most of pornography is ultimately funded by organized crime. So there's a lot of evil things going on in the pornography industry. I had the great opportunity, though, last year for ABC Nightline. They called me up and asked me to be part of a debate in Dallas, and we were at Fellowship Church, and it was me and Ed Young on one side of the debate and a couple other people on the other side, and the debate was this: are we born to cheat? Are we genetically predisposed to be unfaithful in our marriages? And so we went back and forth, and we catch a lot of opposition. We get a lot of response, even from those types of events. And we're called all sorts of names. I get emails all the time, I couldn't even repeat some of the things that are said about how stupid we are, what morons we are, how prehistoric our thinking is. Get with the times. This is the 21st century. Everybody can do what they want. This is a free country. I mean, all kinds of stuff, and much, much worse than that. And I'm here to tell you, as far as suffering goes, the side of the fence to be on is suffering for righteousness. Now, I'm not going to tell you that the discomfort is all that much different. They're both very uncomfortable places to be. But the results are vastly different to suffer for doing good than suffering for doing evil. And so this morning, what we want to do is we look at this issue of suffering. I want to try to talk about three aspects of it. The first of which is, what is our attitude to be? What is our mindset to be concerning this whole issue of suffering, getting opposition for living a holy life? The second thing is, what is our response supposed to be? How are we to respond to the suffering that is inevitable in our lives as a Christian? And then finally, what's our motivation for pressing on even as we suffer? So turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to be in 1 Peter for our time this morning. 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 1. And again, this letter, if I'll remind you, this letter was written by the Apostle Peter, and it was written to believers that were scattered all throughout Asia Minor. And the reason it was written is because these believers were getting opposition. They were getting a lot of opposition to their faith. They were suffering. And Peter wanted to write this letter to encourage them, listen, continue to do good, even in the face of suffering. Continue to live a holy life because that's what you've been called to in God. Continue to do that even as you face suffering. So here in chapter 4, verse 1, Peter says this, therefore, remember last week we talked about this word therefore. Anytime you see it in the Bible, you want to ask, what's it there for? Well, the context of this takes us back to chapter 3, starting in verse 17. He says, it's better if it's God's will to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. That's what we've been talking about. You suffer for doing evil, but it's better to suffer for doing good. Verse 18, for Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. So that's the context of what he's talking about. He says in chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, he paid for sins once for all. He suffered in his body. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude or mindset, because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin. As a result, he doesn't live the rest of his earthly life for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. What he's saying is you need to get your mindset the same as that of Christ, who suffered in his body. He suffered in his body. And did you know that the cross was God's will for Christ? You know, one of the concepts in the Bible that's hard for us to wrap our minds around, and don't be afraid to say there's a lot of things in the Bible that it's hard for you to wrap your mind around. That's one of the things where a lot of people will attack and push you back. They'll say, yeah, but look at this, you can't prove this. Well, okay. It's a life of faith, right? And one of the things that's hard to put your mind around is that Jesus Christ was 100% man and 100% God. Don't try to figure that out. Your mind will explode, okay? It's true, though. He was 100% man and 100% God. He was a human being. And we see some of his humanity the night before he was crucified. He was anguishing over this decision. He was anguishing over what was going to have to happen in order for him to save all of humankind, the cross. And he made a request of his Father. He said, Father, take this cup from me. In essence, he's saying, is there another way besides pain that this can be accomplished? But what ultimately was his attitude? Not my will, but your will be done. You know what that means? That it was God's will that the cross happened. It was God's will that Christ suffered. And so if we are to have the same mindset, as we go through life and we face painful circumstances, or we're facing opposition, or we are suffering, yeah, our flesh is going to rise up and we're going to say in our human nature, I don't like pain.